Hey guys, this is Swartz and once again welcome back to Swartz Tools. Before going into the tutorial, I want to thank you all so much for the support you guys have shown for the last two parts, and I can't tell you how much happy and grateful I am for it. And I hope to get more support and encouragement for the future videos also. For those who are new to this channel, make sure to watch the previous part of these tutorials. I have put the links in the description. So once again, thank you, and now let's talk about the looked element of the apple. So now that we have looked at how the displacement shader for the apple is done, let's start looking at the base color and specular roughness and bump and everything. How I develop the base structure is I start with the simple base color, as I have explained to you earlier. When it comes to the colors, I try to create the first base, the biggest texture variation or color variation there is in the reference. In this case, this is red and yellow color variations, which is the most visible first eye-catching texture variation or color variation which is there. So that's what I try to create at the first. So I always use AI layer RGBA for every texture maps which I create. I usually create displacements and bump, then specular roughness, and then diffuse color. So these are the four main maps I usually create. I don't use specular colors. In PBR workflow, we don't use specular colors mostly. No, almost all the time. It's just some cases when you create, maybe some artistic choices or some creative choices you make. That's when you need specular colors for those particular moments or for some projects or for some reasons. On PBR workflow, we don't need or we don't use the specular color. The breakups and everything on specular we create with IOR and then specular roughness. So the base thing about PBR workflow or this procedural shader which I am creating is whatever goes into the diffuse color, the same fractals and noises, whichever it is, which creates that texture variations or color variations on the diffuse, the same thing goes to the bumps to create the same variation on the bump, and the same thing goes on specular roughness. For example, let's say I created a noise or a fractal and created this variation on these two colors, and maybe I have seen that the specular roughness on the red part is more glossy than the yellow part. So I can use the same fractal or noise which I've used as a mask on diffuse color as the same for creating the specular roughness variations on the same those two parts. And if there is a bump going on the yellow color, I can create the same thing on bump with the same texture I have created. So the workflow is exactly like that. And the second thing, the layers makes it easier for me to organize those things easier. So if you talk about any texture softwares like Mari or Substance Painter, the most basic thing you will see is layers. They will be creating stacks of layers and adding more and more details on different layers, and they will be using those layers again and again for different purposes. Like some layers will be only used for diffuse colors, or some layers will be used only for specular roughness, or in some layers there will be colors, there will be information about bumps, and there will be information about specular roughnesses. So the same workflow they use on texture softwares, I am using it on here Maya. The method is whatever goes into the layers of here will go to the specular roughnesses and bump maps. That's the benefit of procedural shading. You can, you don't have to create different nodes for different attributes. You can create the same or reuse the same nodes, which is the accurate workflow. So just let's look at the diffuse color first. So here we have loads of layers. Okay, 6 layers. So let me disable all of this and we can start from the first one. The first layer is this. As I said earlier, I created the base color variation with a bunch of nodes like fractals and flat colors. So how this coming is, I have created two AI flat nodes which has the two different colors, green and red. Then I have a fractal node. You'll not be able to see the variation clearly here, I guess, because it's very subtle. So I am using the fractal as a blender here, and here if you see, I have used the UV linker for this fractal. This fractal is not using the first UV. I have linked this fractal to the second UV set. So if you right click on the Apple mesh and go to UV sets, UV linking, you can see these are all the nodes which are connected to the map 1, and the second one is connected to fractal 5. Fractal 5 is I guess the fractal 5 is the only connected node. So let me okay. So and then there is another fractal which is using the same colors, and there's a different blend for this. And now I am using so here I'm using an AI isodata color to get the vertex color which I have painted earlier, and with that I am blending these two diffuse colors which I have created with different UV linkings, and with this I am removing the seam which is visible on the back side of the apple. And if you look closely, even after the blending, there will be some amount of UV seam is still visible on the backside, but that's okay for me, because after adding the second, third layers of details on the diffuse part, the seam won't be so much visible there. And the seam is visible because maybe the mask I've created, the luminance value of it, maybe it's not purely 100%, maybe it comes only on 80 or 90 percentage. And in the second layer, which is not a really big variation, this is just another simple variation I've created just to break the textures more. I wanted a little more variations on this. It's mostly, it depends on what you want to see. or how much detail you want to see, how much details you want to break. You know, I can even try to break these flat colors here with another fractal, just creating a little darker variation of this and blending it together, so I get a little more variation on here also. So it depends on your artistic thoughts and process. So that's the second layer. Not very detailed things. And the third layer is the next detail which I wanted to create, which is these stripe patterns. So this thing I have created with a fractal. In here I have used another AI layer, and I am mixing three different types of fractals. So one is a noise, and you can see there is differences in the amount of details here. This one is a little less detailed, this one is very much detailed, and this one is, you know, again very less detailed. So I am blending all these things with the operations. I'm not using mix here. I am blending all these things together to get this output, and I'm not using it straightly into the color. I'm using it as a mix, and I'm using a different color just to get that variation. The color is coming on top of the base color, so that gets this you know, beautiful variation. Again, layer 4, again breaking the variation once more with another set of fractals. Again, the same process which I have done on layer 4, the same process I have repeated with subtle variations on this. So on all of this I'm using repeat UV. I'm changing the repeat UVs just to get that stretched look. And then playing with the ratio and level max. On all of this you can see different ratios, different level max. On most of these things, all the rest of the attributes are all the same. So that's this layer 4. Then layer 5 is the dots. Layer 5 and layer 6, if you see, the connection comes from the displacement granite nodes. The thing, this is the workflow I was talking about earlier. The things which are creating the displacements, the same nodes I am using as a mask to create details on the textures also. So it's not really visible in here, but if you look closer, it's a small, very small, subtle details, but you know, it's a procedural texturing, so I wanted to create as much detail as I can. I was trying, and I was being really experimental. So that's is layer 5 and layer 6. So there is a subtle color variation. Layer 5 is little small black dots, and layer 6 is bigger white colored dots. So if you think, are all these things going to be visible on the Apple when on the in the final output? Let me just say, it's all depends on you. If you want to create these kind of details, you can. If you don't want it, don't do it. So I think the more detail you add, the more real it looks, but there will be a sweet spot, because if you go crazy on these kind of details, you will feel stuck on these if you don't, you know, put a limit on how much details you want. For me, I was, from the beginning onwards, I wanted to create these particular details. I was more focused on mainly three details: the base, main variations, the stripes, and these dots. Those are the main three variations I wanted to create for the apple. So that was the only thing I was focused on, and for me that was my aim for the procedural shading or texturing. So after the layer RGBA, after creating the diffuse, if you see, the same thing goes into subsurface colors. So I have added a triplet. I'll be talking about shading in a few minutes. So I'm just explaining how the nodes I'm using the diffuse color. The same diffuse color goes into subsurface color, and there is another texture which I have using an AI composite, and I'm multiplying the diffuse color with a red color just to create the radius map for the apple. I've used the red, the result felt okay, so I just kept the red as it is. So next thing is specular roughness. If you see the specular roughness map, the same diffuse color, overall diffuse color, I am grading with the AI range, and I am only taking the green channel of my layer RGB of the diffuse, and I am grading it with the AI range. And in the specular roughness, I have also used a base amount of specular roughness, which was 0.2, and then on top of it I'm adding the AI range, which gives me this very subtle result. There was already a nice amount of breakups on the displacement, so I didn't want to create so much of variations on the specular roughness map, because if I go into crazy amount of breakups, then we lose the feel of that organic look. Only hard surface materials has that very rough specular breakup feel. The organics always have that smoothness on the speculars. So I didn't really try to break the speculars very much. I was already getting a nicer amount of specular breakups. So that was all I have done. Usually I do use all these inputs separately on a layer RGBA for the roughness. Just like I have created this diffuse map, I can add all the same mixes into the specular roughness RGBA mix, and you can create different values for different maps, so that you can create specular roughness variations on all these different diffuse variations. So in this case, that all those variations wasn't really needed here. I was getting pretty much good amount of breakups with the displacement and the specular map. So the same thing goes for bump. I was using the layer RGBA, and also I've mainly used the fractals for the bump. Some of the fractals maps are coming from layers, and also I have used an extra separate layer for the bump. there is not much amount of detail comes from bump. I am really using very subtle values. If you see the RGBA values, it's very very subtle. It's almost like zero bump here, because we are already getting good amount of breakups from displacement, so bump wasn't that much needed in this. So that's why the same thing, I haven't used any of those separate breakups in specular roughness. The same thing I've done in bump. I didn't use different uh, fractals or bumps. I didn't create any different uh, variations on bump also. So now we have done with all the procedural texturing methods on things which I have done in this. Let's wind up this with the last thing, which is the shading attributes which I have done for this. So I've mainly used the base color, specular, and then the subsurface. So I haven't used any other things for this. So as I showed you earlier, the base color is also going into the subsurface color, and then there is a composite which is going into the triple S radius, and then I'm using type random walk 2, and these settings which I have tweaked. I was experimenting with again rendering again and again, and I was, for the shading settings, you have to check the renders again and again and tweak the settings here and there to get the output that you want. So I can't just explain how these what settings should you actually put to get the Apple triple S or any other settings. I can't just explain you this is the exact settings that you should put to just get the accurate results for the Apple. I can say that, because those settings are totally up to you. Mostly it can depend on the lighting setup you are using, and the camera angles, or what kind of an Apple, or the what kind of a shading result you are expecting from those settings. So it all depends on you. Mostly I do follow uh, references just to understand the lighting and the shading properties of the objects. And in here you can see there is a, you know I can say that the triple S is very visible in this, and neither I can say that it's purely a diffused thing. There will be definitely scatterings happening, and it's totally up to your point of view and your observations, which will create that the output you desire. So I'm just showing you my settings. It's not really it's nothing really advanced settings. It's just some basic. It's totally depending on the shading and procedural maps. So that's just, I have explained you just now that how did I created all these maps, and the attributes I have changing on the shader itself is just IOR and the subsurface rate. There is nothing else. And there is still, you know talks going on when you are using a triple S object, or a scattering object. There will be no diffuse on it. The whatever detail comes from the or whatever the shading properties on the surface will be fully subsurface scattering properties. So we should put the weight into one. So I have used it on 1, and I have used it on 0.8, and visually I don't feel much difference. It's just artistic preferences, and I'm just using what I felt right visually. So that's what I did. And Now that's all I wanted to talk about the shading of this apple. So next we are going to look at the stem shader. So it's not really very advanced shading network or something. It's just a simple shader. I didn't create any fancy networks for this. Let me show you a quick render for this. Before that, I'm gonna hide all these meshes so that the render will be light. I'm even going to hide this apple. So let's do a quick render. So if you look at the shader, I have given triplets. I've given a little triplets and diffuse, then a little bit of speculoos. That's it. I've created the base color from fractals. So you see there are two colors for the stem, and I have created this RAM which is giving the variation from top to bottom, and again I am creating a different color and see the RAM and the second color on Blender with this fractal. And in this fractal also I have changed the repeat UV so that I get this stretchiness along the length of the stem, and some tweaks on ratio and level max just to get the output, and that gives me this result. And since most of the part is in shadow and only a little bit of the stem is visible on lighting, and then again in the final output it will be mostly in out of focus, so this much of detail was enough for me. And then for the specular roughness, I used the same fractal. I added it into a AI range and tweaked the output min and max. So this was the fractal, and after changing its output min and max, I get this result. So with these settings, I am changing the minimum specular to 0.25 and max specular to 0.45. And then again, I have also added the same fractal to the displacement. So let me see it in basic. So it's giving this displacement details on this stem. So for this also, I have subdivided it into 3 iterations. So this is the stem shading, not much of advanced thing, just some basic tweaks. Again, last one, the water drop shading. So for the water drops, let me just okay. So if you see, these are the ground water drops and these are the water drops on the apple. So on both of them I have assigned the same shader. I have named it water, and on this if you see, it's the shader is not fully transparent. I've adjusted these settings according to what I was seeing on the render. So these settings were giving me the output I was looking for, which is matching to the reference I was following. So I was using a little bit of diffuse with the transmission to get that output. And for the speculars, I've used IOR 1.33 and it's fully glossy. And on the air drops, if you see the air drops mesh, it's another shader which is all 3 of them are AI standard surface. I haven't used any other shaders for this. And so back to airdrop. On this, I've put the transmission to 1, so it's fully transparent shader. And then I've used specular roughness of 0.2 because when I am going to do the post process on it, I want to see bigger, brighter bokehs when I do the defocus. So I wanted to catch some more speculars than the groundwater drops. So for it to catch that much of speculars, I added the roughness to be 0.2. And also, if you think about it in real world, the water drops are falling from top to the apple, so it's on motion, so there will be motion blur on it, and when we capture it, the definitely the specular is going to be blurred with the motion blurs. So the roughness amount, I guess, it kind of matches with the motion and everything. So these are the final shaders of the apple stem and the water drops. So I hope you guys understand this, because it can be a little complicated for someone who's new to this procedural shading workflow, because the shading graph of the apple is not a basic one. If you don't understand most of it, please don't think it like it's a complex technical part, because as I said, the shader which I just showed here is not a basic shader. Also, I didn't demonstrate here how I am testing each of the attributes of the nodes to get the result I'm looking for, since it's a back and forth process of tweaking one attribute, checking the result on render, and again come back and tweak it again until I get the result I'm looking for. The process takes lots of time, and with it, the total length of the tutorial will be longer. So instead of that, I showed you the process I go through. What I have showed you is the final results and the attributes which I have tweaked to get the result. It was already a finished project, and my aim was only to show you guys the workflow and thought process I go through when I do this kind of shaders. I didn't want to show you guys some attribute settings in this node and tell you that if you put these values here, you'll get this result. What I wanted to show you was how I observe a reference and break it down to simple multiple levels of details. As I showed you in the apple's diffuse, that there is 3 major details I noticed on the apple, and those were the details I was aiming to create. Those were first the bigger base color variation, the second the stripes, and the third the dots. So what I wanted to emphasize was not to focus on nodes and attributes, but to focus on these kind of details that make the textures, and think how you can create each of those separately in the shader, and what nodes and its attributes can create such details, those kind of things. And that will totally be depending on your creativity. It won't be like you have a diffuse color attribute on the shader and you can just put a color or texture onto it, right? And there is no fixed method for it. It's all on your head. It's all about your observations. I'm sure that if you guys are trying to create the apple even with the same reference, it won't have the same look, because the observations you make will be totally different than mine. And for anyone who's new to this method, if you find it hard to go this deep in the shading, try doing some simple objects first, so that you can get a grasp on simple basic things like masking and blending of 2 nodes or 2 different colors, and attributes of each nodes, what each attributes does, etc. And definitely practice these things multiple times so that it sticks well with you. Also, I will be doing a basic procedural shading with a simple object soon to show you more clearly my way of working and observations on procedural shading. So make sure you subscribe to this channel so that you won't miss any of the future tutorials. And one more thing I want to add is that when you go with procedural shading, try to avoid creating lots of nodes unnecessarily. Because although the procedural nodes take less reading and rendering time than the file textures, still it's important to optimize the node structure with minimum number of nodes. That way your shading won't get complicated, and also you may save a little time on render. And it's also better to bake the final map to a single texture, and you can save render time in that way too. Arnold has options to bake multiple nodes to single texture map. Now you might be thinking why I didn't do it in my shader network. To be honest, I thought of baking the texture only when I started making this tutorial. Also, there is a disadvantage to baking, which is once the texture is baked, the details will be dependent on the texture resolution, whereas when it's used as a procedural maps, there will be no loss of details. So that was all there was for the look type part. Once again, thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, hit the like button below and make sure to subscribe to this channel for more future contents. Share with your friends who are also interested in lighting and look development. Don't forget to add your opinions and suggestions in the comments below. I'll see you with the lighting part of the tutorial next. Till then, this is Swat signing off. Bye.